I'm really happy to be here, especially at Northwestern, to be talking about the importance of small, unexpected, broken things and what they can tell us about how enslaved Africans in the 18th and 19th century shaped the American landscape in unexpected ways. Now, what I mean by small broken things are the things that were left behind, forgotten, disregarded, thrown out by past peoples. Quite simply, the garbage that results from the activities of everyday life. And generally, when we think about archaeology, we think about grand structures such as what you see right here. This is a plantation in Martinique called Chateau de Bouc. And really, this is a fascinating part in the story of slavery. But what I'm going to do today is I'm going to focus on the more intimate aspects and what they can reveal to us, not only about the lives of slaves, but how those lives of slaves shape the world at large. Primarily, when we talk about archaeology, most people have the impression that we deal with ancient and past cultures, people with limited or sparse written documentation. And really, the kind of archaeology I participate in is an archaeology that brings to bear a full corpus of sources of information, including documentary sources that include account books written by overseers, planters, and estate managers, travelers' logs, illustrations like you see right here. We embrace the full range of what the humanistic disciplines involve. But to a certain extent, these are limited in understanding the lives of slaves. Now, one of the reasons why I think it's important to focus on the small pieces of information is because when we think about slavery, so much of our discussion, so much of the dominant narrative has been what has been lost, what has been destroyed by really one of the most oppressive forms of human bondage in history. These small things enable us to turn the perspective and to change it and to think about what was created and made by people who were living under conditions that most of us can't imagine. Now, in order to do this, the documents that we rely on primarily as historians, anthropologists, archaeologists, and sociologists, we have to recognize that these documents were written from a particular perspective. Very few of the people that we're interested in learning about left behind a documentary record between the 18th and 19th century. So when we think about these small broken things, what we're really looking at is one of the few direct sources of information of the lives they lived, the choices they made, and the networks they were involved in. Now, as many of you know, in 1492, Columbus landed on a small island off of the coast of Florida called San Salvador, which is in the current archipelago of the Bahamas. Also, as many of you know, this brief encounter after this, one of the largest migrations in human history took place, a migration which took Europeans that were merchants, soldiers, settlers, colonists, into the Americas, and then also Africans who were for the most part enslaved to work on plantations ranging from the New England all the way down to Brazil. Now, indeed, between the 16th century and the 19th century, nearly 80% of all migrants from the Old World, from Africa and Europe, were enslaved Africans to work on plantations. And what you see here are the small dots, are the various ranges of archaeological sites of plantations that have been excavated over the past 3 decades. The archaeology of plantations is relatively recent. It started in part because of laws that were put in place in the United States to protect archaeological sites. And as people were actually conducting surveys of various areas in the Southeast, they started to realize that there is an immense amount of material culture having to deal with the colonial past. And I'd like to add, without those laws, we would have lost a considerable amount of information about this very important part of our history. Now, I'm going to be focusing primarily on the concept of the Americas and the American landscape. But I'm going to be taking us to various parts of the world, and I'm going to primarily spend a lot of my time in the Caribbean and focus on very small parts of plantations that you can kind of make out in the upper right-hand corner here. And these are the excavations of houses where enslaved laborers lived. Now, where most of these 80% of the people who came to the Americas wound up were on plantations much like this. plantations were agricultural enterprises where cash crops such as sugar, coffee, cotton, indigo were grown. They were processed in industrial buildings. And it shouldn't be lost on you that when we're talking about the Industrial Revolution, in many ways, the factories that turned sugar cane into molasses, sugar, and rum were some of the first factories in the modern world. Now, in depictions like you see here, these were painted for planters who were oftentimes absentee, living in London or Paris, who wanted a view of their property in the Americas. They were painted with a particular depiction in mind, one which favored a view where you see the effects of the labor that ran these plantations in the manicured estate grounds, the buildings built, and actually the factories working. But what you don't see in these paintings are the actual laborers working. You don't see the enslaved Africans. And so when we do the archaeology of plantations, oftentimes we're very interested in shifting that perspective to a perspective of what that plantation landscape would look like from the house yard of the enslaved laborer, by capturing not only where the location of the house was, but where the area directly outside of it, the kinds of things that we would find in it. Because for most part, on these plantations, a lot of the social life, the gossiping, the taking care of household, took place in these areas called the house yard. And right here you see my crew chief, Edward Thomas, actually excavating a house yard in Sugarloaf. Now, the people who lived in these houses were part of a much larger economic network of production and trade that carried goods in which they grew, processed into Europe in the holds of ships, whereby manufactured goods would be placed into other ships that would be brought down to Africa and traded for human cargo, or brought directly to the Caribbean for the purpose of displays of conspicuous consumption on the part of planters and European colonists. Those holds would then be filled up with, again, the processed goods. This has been simplified into a term called the triangle trade, but at the center of this larger economic system was the labor of Africans who were actually producing the majority of the fuel that fueled the early Atlantic economy. Now, one would think when we excavate those house yards that I was telling you about, where labor is such an important aspect of what people do in their life, that when you go and excavate their lives, you would find artifacts and materials that are associated with the actual production of field goods. And it's actually an unexpected result when you actually look at all of the plantations that have been looked at over the past 30 years. There's a particular organization I work with. This is the Monticello Foundation. They run something called the Digital Archaeological Archive of Comparative Slavery. This is a large storehouse of information, mostly artifacts in the form of a database that has been curated and collated by the directors of the project. And essentially it holds information on what has been found for nearly 30 years of research. So as I thought about putting together this presentation, I decided to just quickly query it, quickly see what kinds of artifacts we find when we look at slavery as a whole. And interestingly enough, when we go ahead and query the database, which has nearly 1.5 million artifacts in it, we find only 500 artifacts that are directly related with field labor. We actually only find 2 shackles in the entire database. Actually, and I struggled a way to kind of graphically represent this, and I love word clouds. And if you actually look and take that database and you plug it into a Google word cloud maker, you'll find what we find. We find tobacco pipes, we find tableware, buttons, bottles, things that are associated with the everyday life. And what these things tell us, they enable us to imagine a world in which people wore livery, in which people used knives to cut food, where people during the brief points of respite in the regimes of labor would smoke tobacco, drink rum, drink wine, and actually try and find a release from their hard conditions. Now, as a whole, this enables us to paint a fairly broad picture that's interesting. But what I find very important about these artifacts is each artifact you see here tells a unique story in its own life. In fact, if we think of each artifact as having a biography, where it was made, how it was transported, where it was used, and how it was used, it tells a particular story that reveals the life histories of the people who made and used it. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to shift focus and think about a particular estate. Now, you can't take one estate, one plantation in the world, and use it as a way to generalize about an entire Atlantic system. But what you can do is you can use the artifacts and the things found from it and generate questions that are of universal interest for researchers working on this topic. This is an estate that I've been working on for the past 4 years. It's a place called Bois-Côtelet. It's in a small island in the Eastern Caribbean called Dominica. And if you go visit there today, and you actually can, you'll see what you see in this slide. You'll see the estate house. You'll see the presence of a coffee mill. You'll see the presence of a boiling house. You'll see the presence of a sugar mill. And indeed, what is a constant reminder when you walk through this American landscape is the labor of the people who worked it. What takes effort is actually to look at where the laborers lived. And indeed, if you were to go and try and find the village where the enslaved laborers lived, you would have to go back into the very dense forest that you see behind the grounds there and do a considerable amount of prospection. And for the past 4 or 5 years, we've been doing this. And in the process of doing this, we've been coming up with some very interesting finds that reveal the kinds of lives that people lived, and in a sideways fashion, the stories of the people, the stories that revolve around the artifacts that they left behind. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go and I'm going to talk about 3 artifacts. I'm going to talk about 3 artifacts that I found that, not myself, but people who have worked with me have found over the past 4 years. Michael Sanford, who's a Colonial field technician that works with me in Dominica, found this one stone blade in a screen as he was sifting dirt that came from the house floor of the village. Now, the house was probably built sometime in the 1750s, well before the British formally colonized the island, yet there was a plantation here. Now, a stone blade is not necessarily an odd thing to find in an American landscape. Indeed, if you go across the entirety of the Americas, you'll find lithic technologies or stone technologies. But one of the things that struck me, and more importantly Michael, is interesting, is when we looked at the composition, or we looked at the stone that this blade was made of, it didn't resemble any of the local stones. Indeed, it was actually far closer to the kinds of flint one would find on English gun flints. I recorded in my notes at the time when this was found that it was most likely came from ballast. Now, stone tools like this would have been used and fashioned by enslaved laborers to either, in an expedient fashion, to scrape off the skins of root crops such as cassava, or to actually go ahead and make twine to put together expedient lean-tos, expedient little shelters. Now, in the process of this, many people have talked about expediency in terms of the material culture of slave life as one of the ways to interpret these. But one of the arguments I would like to make is that behind this expediency, there's a design. There's a design of things and ideas that people brought with them from Africa into the Americas to learn how to adapt to a new landscape. So this ballast that the stone tool was later shaped into would have been in one of the holds that probably carried goods from Europe and North America into the Caribbean. And one of the things that was of great importance in terms of shipments coming to a place like Dominica were provisions or food for enslaved laborers. Indeed, if you look at many of the plantations in some of the colonies in North America, many of them were devoted to the growing or processing of foodstuffs to be used on plantations. So, for example, if you go to Long Island, a small little estate called Shelter Island off the east coast of Long Island, There was a place that was purely focused on growing beef cattle that they would then later salt and butcher and bring down to the Caribbean to feed enslaved laborers. Similarly, the entire lowland colony of South Carolina would have been devoted for the most part for producing rice at a certain point that would have been later used to feed enslaved laborers throughout the British world. Now, a lot of these provisions relied on mercantile networks, relied on trade and exchange. But during the 18th century, the vagaries of warfare and hurricanes, and even the time it took for transport, meant that such provision systems were not entirely reliable. A local system set up in the Caribbean and also some North American colonies developed whereby planters by law or practice would set aside plots of land where enslaved laborers were given a chance in their quote-unquote free time to go ahead and grow food for themselves. Now, these plots of land were either called provision grounds or gardens, and they were generally located in fairly marginal parts of the land. In this I don't know how to do that. Sorry about that. In this 18th century illustration that you find in the Diderot Encyclopedia, you actually see a numbered illustration where it has a provision ground marked on the landscape. Now, what's interesting about in many parts of the Caribbean is that these provision grounds became a necessary function for the maintenance of the plantation. They also become a space of possibility for the contributions of Africans into the Americas. We oftentimes forget that there was an African botanical legacy to Africans in the Americas. We oftentimes think of plantations as places where only cash crops were grown, but they were also places where cultigens and foodstuffs and the ideas on how to make and use them were brought from Africa. And indeed, focusing on these provision grounds become an interesting place to think about how an actual environmental landscape is shaped. Now, in these provision grounds, in time when people had surplus, they went ahead and they sold these goods on local street markets. In the British West Indies, you had a series of established Saturday and Sunday street markets where people would come together and purchase either root crops or vegetables or foodstuffs grown on other parts of the island, imported trade wares from Europe, or even locally produced items such as ceramics, baskets, and mats. And with this system, people were actually able to accumulate currency and cash. Now, this became a space of social interaction, and I'm going to talk about this in a little bit. But one of the things that fueled this economy, which became an important part of the internal economy of the entire Caribbean, were, again, these provision grounds. Now, the provision grounds, again, were located in the marginal landscapes, and what I'd like you to imagine is that in many places, these marginal parts of the plantation were actually abutting other marginal parts of other plantations. And so you would actually have spaces where enslaved laborers, such as the case of Bois Côtelette, you would have enslaved laborers meeting enslaved laborers from other plantations, growing their foodstuffs. Now, this again was a possibility for a contribution of African botanical legacy, but also social legacy. And so if I were to go, we went up to where the provision grounds were for Bois Côtelette, we actually walked around the fields, which are still used for similar gardens today. And in the turned up soil, you actually find material culture associated with daily life. You find medicine bottles. You find the wood scrapers, the stone scrapers made to make wood lean-tos. You find cooking pots. You find liquor bottles. You find the kind of evidence of social interaction that we would normally only think of as in terms of going on in the village. Therefore, when we think about the geography of the village and of the plantation, we have to extend the boundaries of social life beyond the confines of the actual village. And we can actually use material culture to think about a geography that was unexpected to the planters, where social interaction went beyond the actual boundaries of their estate. Now, As I mentioned before, with the surplus that people would grow on their estates, they were actually able to accumulate cash, and they were actually able to furnish their household. And we have evidence from this, from the kinds of things that we find around the houses. Now, if we were to go back 20 years and ask an archaeologist what all of these items meant, most people would have assumed that these were goods that were handed to the enslaved laborers by planters, that these were either hand-me-downs or that they were things part of the provisioned assemblage. Now, what's interesting about this assemblage, this curation of artifacts that you see right here, is that these are the kinds of goods that you would find on any table in the 18th century, maybe of a lesser quality, but they would have been things that you would have found. Any archaeologist in the room would be able to identify the kinds of patterns and decorations involved here. Now, this informs us that when people actually put together their artifacts, they were making choices. They were displaying things in ways that we wouldn't necessarily have considered earlier. These artifacts also tell us and link us to alternate geographies in a very other interesting way, in that the economic networks in which these artifacts came into the household were part of this larger street market system. Now, those imported wares are very useful, but one of the things that we can go ahead and track these economic networks is by looking at things that the enslaved laborers made, used, and designed themselves within the colonies that they lived. Now, for the most part, these objects would have disintegrated in the harsh conditions of the soils of the southeast United States or the Caribbean. But we do have one kind of item that we consistently find on plantation sites across the Americas. They're variously called colonial ware, cocoa neg. They're essentially crudely made pottery that's hand-built, low-fired, and they tend to be utilitarian. For the most part, we think that they're made by people of African descent. Now, the particular pot you see here was found by Lacey Carpenter, a Northwestern student, who was stumbling across a field wall in 2010. She came across this, and she guessed that this was something important. In later excavations, we actually were able to find out that there was a house there, and where she found the pot was a cooking area. And so this pot was probably a cooking pot, and it could tell us a series of different kinds of things. I got very excited when we found this because this is one of the more complete pieces of pottery of this type that we found. Now, pottery is very useful in that it's a container of culture. It contains the way people did things, how they made the pottery, how they used that pottery to cook food, present themselves. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you find decorations which might insist on meanings other than immediate function. In the case of pottery found in southeast United States, specifically in coastal Carolina, one archaeologist has found consistently pottery with X marks on the bottom of the bowl. Now, many people initially thought that these were just simply maker's marks, identifying the potter who made them. But the location of this pottery and the absence of decorations like this on other kinds of pots that were made probably by the same potters indicated to him that there was something probably going on here. Now, this gentleman, Leland Ferguson, argued that this represented a cosmogram, something similar to the Bakongo cosmogram found in Central Africa, and that what was represented here was a cosmogram of the universe in which the cycle of life is represented. He would later go on to argue that these specific pots were used in rituals by enslaved Africans in South Carolina. Now, this is, of course, of considerable debate, but it does open possibilities of meaning. Pots are also useful because they're a plastic form of material culture, and they can be shaped in many, many ways that talk about the immediacies of everyday life. These immediacies might include the kinds of things you cook pots on, such as this brazier, water that you store things in, storing grain, poaching fish, cooking vessels, and then also how one relieves themselves in urban environments. This range of shapes of pottery tells us about the creative abilities of enslaved laborers under these harsh conditions. But more importantly, the ability to make pottery is not something that's easily mastered. Indeed, the pots that you find here reveal something more important, that when people came to the Americas, some of these people were lay geologists, they were lay material scientists, and they were able to assess the local environment and use traditions of pottery manufacture that they learned in their home country and apply them and pass them on for generations. Indeed, in some islands, we have a continuous tradition of pottery manufacture that dates from the 17th century all the way up to the present. These are a series of photos taken from Jamaica, and what you see here is a woman who's colloquially known as Ma Lu, or Louisa Jones. She was one of the master potters of a tradition of pottery making called Yabas. I talk a lot with her daughter, and Ma Lu taught her daughter how to make the pottery, and Ma Lu learned how to make the pottery from her mother. Now, we could actually match the pots that Ma Lu made with historic photographs from the late 19th and early 20th century and actually see a one-to-one analog. And in fact, I showed this photo to Ma Lu's daughter, and she was kind of perplexed, but she said that, oh yes, I can make this pot and I can make this pot. Now, the beauty of this photo is that we can actually match up the specific shapes and forms to an archaeological assemblage that we find from the 17th century Port Royal and see how this one tradition of pottery manufacture gets passed down. So when we think about this one instance, it's not too difficult to extend that transmission of knowledge from the 17th to the 20th century backwards into West Africa. Now, in certain parts of the world, in certain parts of the plantation Americas, we don't have this knowledge of long-term pottery manufacture. So when we come across pots like you see here, we ask the questions, how was this made? Who made this and where was this made? And actually, because pots are a kind of human-made metamorphosed rock, we can borrow techniques from earth sciences, from chemistry, to apply to these ceramic materials and determine with a degree of confidence where in the world they were made. And so if we look at that pot that Lacey found in Bois Côtelette, we can say with some confidence it was probably made in Martinique at the height of the Napoleonic Wars. Now, in the map that you see to the right-hand side is a schematic of the movement of pots from various places of production, such as Martinique, St. Lucia, Guadeloupe, to other islands such as Dominica, Antigua, and St. Martin. Now, of course, the pots did not move themselves. People had to move the pots. And during a time period where there's wars between Britain and France, and you have colonies where pots are being traded between the holdings of those two empires, this introduces a very interesting calculus into how that landscape is being shaped. During a time period when political boundaries were of great importance and their integrity was of great importance, the street markets like these that you see here were extending the networks of the enslaved beyond the plantation and beyond the house yard, and then also beyond the colony. So we can imagine not only an economic infrastructure for the plantation, but also a social infrastructure for the enslaved, where gossip could be milled, information could be passed from one plantation to the next, from one colony to next, and indeed, in some cases, slave rebellions organized. This social infrastructure was a way in which new meanings were asserted into this landscape. And it's these meanings that I'd like to turn to for the final story, the final artifact. This is perhaps one of the most perplexing artifacts we came across. Most people would look at this artifact and think of it as having very little significance. My crew chief, Edward Thomas, came across this as he was excavating a post-emancipation house at Bois Côtelette. It's the base of a teacup, that has been chipped into a circular disc and then smoothed in a way against a grinding stone. Now, what's interesting about this piece is that it's not the only one of its kind. We find these kinds of disc-shaped objects throughout the plantation Americas. Now, some people have argued that this is the result of humans living in close contact with chickens, where chickens might eat broken pieces of pottery and through gizzards smooth it down. But the consistent shape of it calls this explanation into question. Still others have argued it might have been a token to be used in the economic system that I talked about earlier. One idea that has been somewhat taken as a probability, although there's still some questions, is that it was a gaming piece that was fashioned for games like Mancala or checkers. And so that what we see here is some sort of way in which people refashioned European objects into their own purposes to pass their time. It's actually, objects like these introduce more questions than answers. And it's the kind of thing that makes looking at these small things very, very interesting, especially when items that have been made to be used in a certain way get modified and reused in other ways. Perhaps there's nowhere where this is more clear when we look at the ways in which imported goods and local goods are used in things in which communities come together. I'm going to focus right now on burials, and I've decided not to depict any of the photos illustrated with the burials because I don't have permission from the descendant communities. But burials are an incredibly interesting form of information for archaeologists to look at. The reason for this is because skeletons house the life history of a body. So you can actually see the harsh conditions in which enslaved laborers lived by looking at the term we would use would be pathologies on the skeleton. You can look at developmental diseases, you can track traumas that have occurred from repetitive use of arms in swinging cane bills to cut cane. But there's also something else that's important about burials, which is these are moments in which communities come together and define themselves and define the individual being buried. And so there's relatively few burials that have been excavated in the Americas. And one fairly interesting one, or one find that I find very compelling, are 4 burials that were found underneath house floors in Seville, Jamaica. Now, the location of burials underneath house floors, one can see very analogous traditions in West Africa. But more importantly, what we can see is variation in the way that people were identified through the associated trade goods. So for example, this one burial that you see represented here, this is an individual that was quite old in life. He suffered from some developmental diseases, including some form of anemia. But right on top of the coffin, there was a very large lock placed right on top. And if you look at the other 3 burials found within these house yards, you found one young male had a carpenter's compass found next to him, another a folding knife, and a young woman had a chipped glass medicine bottle stopper on top, with her. Now, one can only imagine what these things were meant to signify, but we can probably assume that these had something to do either with the profession or the way that the community identified them. And so if we think back to this lock that was found on top of the skeleton, we have more questions than answers. But one of the things we can say is that probably this was someone who the community felt whose power could extend beyond the coffin. And this was probably something that was there to keep the person in place. Now, I think what's really important when we focus on these 3 objects is that when we think about slavery, oftentimes we consider what slaves made for other people. Very rarely do we consider what they made for themselves. There's a power in the artifacts that we find because they cause us to ask that very question. What were these things made for? Why were they used? And how did they help people assert a new context in the American landscape? Thank you.
We're going to open this up to a question and answer session, and I'm sure a lot of you have questions for Professor Hauser. So if you raise your hand, we will try to fit in as many questions as possible. Who has a question for Professor Hauser?
Does the presentation you gave us, is that representative of the, as well of the U.S. experience?
That's a really good question, and I'm gonna have to dodge it a little bit, to a certain extent, in that when we talk about plantation life, we have a certain axiom, which is no plantation is the same and no colony was the same. Now, I would argue that many of the questions that I addressed today are the kinds of questions that my colleagues working in the Southeast United States, the kinds of questions that are working in the Northeast United States who work on plantation slavery are asking, and we're in constant dialogue with each other. I think a more important point is that when we're talking about this period of slavery, we can't necessarily divide the world up into the United States versus the Caribbean, that these worlds were intimately linked into a larger world that survived off of slavery. Now, most of the time, we think of that in terms of the kinds of economic networks that linked one colony to the next, such as the movement of rice from South Carolina to Jamaica. I would also like to add that there's the potential that people moved. So we do have documents, for example, of native North Americans being taken to the Caribbean and enslaved there. We do have documents of enslaved Africans being brought between colonies from the different parts of the Americas. So that what is being asked here is not just of general interest, it's generalizable, but there are actually specific histories that can be linked. And these artifacts are one way to get at those.
Okay, I think we have a question on the other side of the room. No? Well, we have one here.
What about the African burial ground in New York City, in Manhattan?
Thank you so much for asking that. I was asked to talk about digging plantations. So I have probably left out one of the most important finds in terms of the archaeology of slavery in the African diaspora in the past 30 years. I apologize for that, but I tried to keep a focus on the unit of analysis here, and that was the plantation. The African burial ground, for those of you that don't know, was a project that has been headed and is still headed by Michael Blakey. And this was a project that developed as a federal building was being built in downtown Manhattan. And quite simply, it's probably one of the largest collections of intact burials associated with enslaved Africans in the Americas. The work that they have been doing there has been absolutely fascinating for multiple reasons. I'm going to kind of briefly talk about the general archaeological findings, but I'm telling you what I think is the most important thing about that project. First of all, the skeletons have, along with the skeletons, there's been a rich set of material culture associated with it. Some of that material culture include beads, they include the ways that people adorn themselves, they include, as I talked about before, the way the community identified with the individuals that were buried there. But also you have things like the kind of skeletal pathologies, the traumas associated with it. And what this brings into stark contrast is that slavery was harsh in New York, that there was slavery in New York, and that to a certain extent it was a part of the history that was overlooked. And so when the burial ground started, the burial ground was found in the process haphazardly, I might add, in the excavation of the federal building, and then later taken on the systematic excavation, this wonderful research by Michael Blakey, you had a real chance to reignite a historical conversation about what New York looked like in the 18th century. I think just to give you a sense, one of the more important things, I think, was the way that Michael went ahead and handled this. Rather than being the archaeologist who developed his own questions in isolation, he went out to the local community and he actually asked the community what they thought the important questions were. He involved the local community in interpretation. He involved the local community in the question development. And you know what? The questions the community asked were not very much different from the questions that an archaeologist asked. Who were the people that lived here? What was their life like? Where did they come from? Is there any evidence of the kind of cultural continuities between Africa and the Americas? And you know, he found answering those questions some really enticing ideas. I think there's been a lot of talk about the Sankofa symbol, which is a particular symbol that one finds in coastal Ghana today. But I think some other things that have been maybe not looked at as much are the actual evidences of where these people came from. Things like dental modification. There are certain parts in West Africa where teeth would be modified and shaped in particular ways. And he would come across this in these burials. These would be immediate links between the context of slavery and the lives people might have lived beforehand. Thank you for asking that question.
One
Okay.
question. The slaves in the Caribbean compared to our southern slaves, were they different, or were there similarities?
Well, that's a very complicated question in multiple ways. The first thing to keep in mind is that slavery as a state and a condition was harsh throughout the entire Atlantic world. Now, we can talk about, let me ask, are you interested in, are the slaves different or is slavery different? Okay, so yeah, it's a very difficult question because a lot of the time period we're talking about, France had colonies in North America, France had colonies in the Caribbean. Britain had colonies in North America, Britain had colonies in the Caribbean. You can talk about certain laws being more followed, such as the provision ground law that I talked about in the Caribbean than, let's say, in continental North America. But for the most part, what we're dealing with is a condition of servitude in which there were general principles that each empire held to. Ultimately, in both places, we're talking about a time period where people tried to de-animate people. There was a core contradiction of slavery. And that contradiction was that people rejected the humanity of the people that they were making their money off of, but at the same time, they were being forced to live with them. And whether or not you were in the Southeast United States or in the Caribbean, that contradiction held true in both places.
I have two questions. You mentioned that the skeleton showed the history of what had happened to the people, but you never mentioned what kinds of things happened to the people because, of course, the Caribbean was where many slaves were sent to be hardened before they went to other places. So I thought maybe it would be helpful for us to get some understanding of the kind of conditions that people lived in by knowing what kinds of traumas they experienced. And then secondly, I was wondering how the Dominicans and the Jamaicans and the Barbadians, how do they feel about your work looking at the plantation life when many of those places and countries have spent time trying to deal with the continuing after effects of colonization?
I think both of those are excellent, excellent questions. I apologize for not going too much into the detailed life histories of the skeletons that were recovered. In part, this was because this was the work of Armstrong and Fleischman, but also in part because of the time I had to spend. One thing that can be said is that the mortality rates of enslaved laborers working on sugar plantations were quite high. And this is very evident on the skeletons. Now, one of the skeletons that you saw, generally what you would see with field labor, and I apologize about giving a brief intro to bioarchaeology, but when we think about bone, we have to think about it as a tissue. We have to think about it as something that's working in response to the environment around you. And so when you see someone who is constantly engaged in physical labor, field labor, you start to see the development of ridges on the bone, that indicate higher developments of musculature. But you also start to see the kinds of traumas that people face. If you're working in a plantation, you are very much at physical risk at a constant time, either from mules kicking you, from getting burnt by boiling sugar water. And you can actually see the repeated breakages that people had in the past and the healing, the kinds of ways that those breakages healed. In addition, you can see in a particular kind of condition called dental hypoplasia, which is softening of the teeth enamel, where people were systematically malnourished because they quite simply didn't have enough food or the right kinds of food to sustain themselves. Now, I don't necessarily know enough about the history involved of people being brought to the Caribbean to quote unquote season them to be brought to North America. And nor do I think that these skeletons particularly speak to it. But I do think the skeletons speak to the larger point that the conditions of enslaved life were very, very harsh on sugar plantations. Now, as to your second question, I think that's a wonderful question. And indeed, when I started doing this work, the African burial ground was right in its height. And I learned many lessons from this, and that's to include the community in all my work. In fact, my work in Jamaica and Dominica and Martinique was all brought about by the auspices of folks there asking me to do this work. And that's not an excuse, that's not kind of a short answer. What it is an entry into talk about what responsible archaeology is. Responsible archaeology is not just about producing results so that I can, write papers and get a promotion. But responsible archaeology is very much about understanding why documenting a history like this is very important. People live today with the scars of slavery still. And indeed, you can actually look at the attitudes and inclinations people have towards plantation landscapes today and see differences in the ways that people approach the past. Now, in the case of my work in Jamaica, it was actually one of the best places to start one's career because I was working under the auspices of the Jamaican National Heritage Trust. And the burial of the one individual you saw there with one of the gentlemen, one of the younger men, when I first landed, it was just near the celebration of emancipation in Jamaica. And the Asantehene from Ghana had sent a delegation to celebrate the abolition of slavery in Jamaica and also to take the bones in an unexpected way back to Africa. And this was just an amazing celebration that took place at Seville because it was a time when you had folks who didn't necessarily get along with each other, religious groups who didn't necessarily get along with each other, come to this very all-night-long celebration in which you had maroon populations coming down from a Kampong town, governmental delegates coming up from Kingston, and all of them taking part in a mile to celebrate and to think about this one individual who died some time ago. So it's, the idea of community archaeology is something that's important for not only thinking about why we do what we do, but also oftentimes the most interesting questions are not the ones that we're addressing as scholars.
Okay, we have time for one or two more questions. I see some down here.
Were the pots that you talked about made by individual slaves for their own use or to trade, or was there one place on a plantation that made all the pots? Or it's probably every different pan?
Well, I would invite you to read my book, Archaeology of Black Markets. University of Florida Press. No, but seriously, to answer that question really shortly, when I first started working with pottery and working with potters, the general idea was that this stuff was made ad hoc. It was made expediently, primarily by women in their house to just put together a quick cooking pot. And it was described in a fairly disparaging way in that it was quote-unquote crudely made, it wasn't very well made, it didn't show craftspersonship behind it. And actually, my study, which was probably one of the first systematic studies of a large representation of pots from the region, showed two things. First of all, that there were very few locations where these pots were made. In other words, there were workshops. There were people whose lives were devoted to making pottery. And that secondly, this pottery moved in ways that were not anticipated by the colonial officials. And so you had an organization of craft production that probably went beyond the planter's notice and was probably much more robust than we generally give kind of traditions like that credit for. But more importantly, that there was a design behind its manufacture. There was a consistency in the way things were made. There was actually an elegance in its manufacture, its shape, and there was an aesthetic behind its form.
I'm curious about the custom of burial under the house floor, and is that common in Africa?
Well, you know, the common, I am hesitant to talk about anything being common in Africa because we're talking about a continent with incredible environmental, ecological, linguistic diversity in which practices vary from one location to the next. So if you take a place like Ghana, for example, which is, I think, roughly the size of Texas, the number of languages in different groups that are housed in that one nation and the practices associated with it vary. Now, certainly in some parts of West Africa, burials do take place underneath house floors, but I wouldn't necessarily state it as an African kind of project. I mean, it's something where you can possibly think about this is a way in some parts of West Africa or some parts of Central Africa where people did do things. And it invites questions to then ask. It doesn't necessarily say that this is necessarily an African practice.
Okay, we do have time for one more question. Would anyone else like to ask the professor a question?
Do any remnants of the provisional market still exist in the Caribbean?
So you can see, yes, absolutely yes. Basically, when I'm working in the Caribbean, I feed my field crew basically off of the same kind of markets that were present just after emancipation. That's where we purchase our food. And indeed, it's a way that a lot of people purchase their food in certain parts of the Caribbean. Globalization has, changed a lot of things in terms of the way people make their living and the way people get their food. And so you can't make a blanket statement. But certainly, I would say that it's important to highlight that we can look at the way that people do things today. And that doesn't necessarily create a direct trace backwards, but it informs us on the kinds of constraints and conditions people lived in. And when we think about the linking of communities, certainly street markets exist, and it's still where you find out what's going on other parts of the island or who's doing who to what. It's a place of social interaction. It's a place of economic barter and exchange. It's a place of friendship and hatred. I mean, it's a great place to actually study the way that communities are made and maintained.
All right, thank you very much. And thank you all for coming.